Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Neil Howard, here on Health Professional Radio, in studio with Dawn Marie Stoll. Now, Dawn's a scientific director and lead of global medical affairs at Takeda Oncology, and she's joining us to talk about the INSIGHT-MM, or multiple myeloma study. It's the largest pharmaceutical company-sponsored global observational study of its kind in multiple myeloma. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Dawn Marie Stoll.
Thanks, Neil, and it's really a pleasure to be here.
I'm glad that you could take the time and talk with us. Now, I understand that you're working with this pharmaceutical company-sponsored study. Aren't studies usually sponsored by pharmaceutical companies?
Yes, Neil, you're right. Studies are, typically sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. However, we do see clinical trials and other studies being done that are run, if you will, by other organizations. You will often see what we call investigator-initiated studies, which are studies that are really sponsored and driven by the lead investigator or the institution where that investigator works. And then, in addition, one of the other areas that comes to mind is studies that are conducted through some of our cooperative groups, where they really are driven by that cooperative group, the investigators and healthcare providers involved in that study group, if you will. Funding can come from pharma for some of those studies. Pharma doesn't really have a say in the development or the conduct of those trials.
Now, the INSIGHT-MM, multiple myeloma study, what is multiple myeloma?
So multiple myeloma is a disease that affects the plasma cells of the patient, and that because of the abnormal activity of the plasma cells or the bones that develop, essentially the patient's immune system is affected, as well as their ability to reconstitute their marrow, as we would expect. And as a result of that, patients often present with a spectrum of symptoms that we call CRAB symptoms, which stands for changes in their calcium levels. Patients can experience some fairly significant renal impairment. They can also become anemic because of the involvement of the abnormal cells in the bone marrow. And then finally, the bone is a target where we often see these pretty dramatic, what we call lytic lesions in the bone of patients where we see the destruction from the malignant cells.
Now, with all these studies and potential studies, all of this data that's coming in, are pharmaceutical companies such as yours utilizing real-world data to develop their drugs?
So, Neil, that is a really great question, and I think Takeda is probably not unique in our recent thought of really including and incorporating data from real-world studies. As you know, the gold standard has always been the development of drugs through a randomized controlled trial, where we hope to show the unequivocal efficacy of a new treatment or intervention. However, the limitation of a study like that, while it's well controlled to prevent bias in terms of enrollment and patient characteristics, the study overall is conducted under what we consider more ideal circumstances, with very rigorous eligibility criteria. So the deficit that we have, if you will, from data like that is we really don't have a good understanding of the true benefit that a therapy will then show when it's used as part of routine clinical practice, where patients will be treated who would not meet the eligibility criteria to participate in that randomized controlled trial. So it's really a situation where if we can conduct really strong, rigorous randomized controlled trials and also conduct very rigorously done real-world data, and we can combine the results of those, we really have a much better picture of how a therapy is likely to work and affect the broader population of patients.
Now, let's talk about this INSIGHT study. Other than being the largest pharmaceutical company-sponsored global study of its kind in multiple myeloma, what sets it apart? And talk about some of the results.
Another really great question. So I think one of the things that really sets this study that we're conducting in the real-world setting apart from other initiatives that have been done is the fact that it is global in nature. We are open in 15 countries. If you look historically at some of the other real-world data studies or registry observational studies done by other pharma companies, you'll see that they're often focused in the U.S. Or in Europe, or in U.S. and Europe to some degree. But we really felt it was important to branch out and include some countries in Asia and Latin America, as those are geographies where we really don't have a good understanding of how myeloma patients have been historically managed or how they are being currently managed. So the global aspect is really key. The other step that we took early on, which was really exciting for me and is still very exciting, and I think it speaks a lot to Takeda's focus on the patient at the center of all that we do, is we have a very large steering committee that has KOL experts in myeloma from around the globe. But as one of our founding steering committee members, we invited a patient to join that committee to help advise us and make sure that we were not designing a protocol that would be untenable for patients or difficult for them to be able to comply with what we were asking them to do. And that worked out fantastic from the aspect of incorporating some patient-reported outcomes into the study, where we can really learn about how the treatments that are being used in routine clinical practice are impacting the patient's quality of life. And one other thing I'd just like to note, which was not expected on my part, it was so successful to have our patient representative on the steering committee that actually the patient members of the steering committee came to me and said, "It's so great to have this patient perspective. Can we have another patient on the steering committee?" So at this point, we have a patient representative, we have a caregiver representative, and we most recently added a member who represents a patient advocacy group in Europe to really help ensure that we are maximizing the value of the output from the study for patients and caregivers, and not only focusing on the treating physicians and prescribers.
I understand how crucial it is for patients to be involved in the drug development process. What about the education process with other patients? Are they active in educating other patients from a patient perspective as opposed to simply a clinician's or researcher's perspective on a particular treatment?
Yes, Neil. In fact, we are in the process now of developing a parallel publication plan, if you will, that will focus on patients and caregivers and advocacy groups, in addition to our pub plan that we have for generating data for medical congresses and manuscripts in scientific journals. So we are definitely maximizing the perspective and expertise for our steering committee members, and really, relying on them to advise us in terms of the content of patient-facing pieces, how to get those pieces of information broadly circulated globally. As you can imagine, there are a lot of difficulties in terms of understanding local country regulations and compliance, and how you can tap into patients and access them directly to provide information. So these members are crucial in helping us navigate that very complex system, with the ultimate goal of sort of not being deterred by the challenges, but really pushing forward to make sure that the patients have access to the information and can be empowered to help in making their treatment decisions.
Is there a website that we can go to and get some more information about this INSIGHT study?
Yes, there is a listing on clinicaltrials.gov that we could refer interested listeners to look at. And then in addition to that, there is contact information. So if anyone wants, any additional information or context or feedback, they can reach out directly to myself, and we can provide them with the information that they're requesting.
Thank you so much for joining us on the program, Dawn. It's been a pleasure. Hoping you'll come back and tell us more about Takeda Oncology and what you're involved in, okay?
All right. Thank you, Neil. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Transcripts and audio of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.